right, welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be covering the note sheet for the next subunit within American Romanticism, which is Transcendentalism. So if you recall from last time, we covered the Knickerbocker School, and earlier we talked about characteristics of Romanticism in general in a sort of pan-European context. And as you'll see, American Romanticism on my timeline of American literature, not by any means comprehensive, but a pretty good guide to the major movements. We've got the Knickerbocker School up here, followed by Transcendentalism. And so today we're going to be talking about some of the generic characteristics of Transcendentalism before we get into some of the unit vocab. And so the big idea that I want you to take away from this is what Emerson, in one of his private journals, Emerson wrote a lot of journals, talked about as the central dogma or the central idea of Transcendentalism. Because Transcendentalism is a literary movement that is very different, and for many students, very disappointing coming after the Knickerbocker School. After you read Washington Irving, William Cullen Bryant, you have short stories, you have poems, you have drama, you have this sort of explosion in literary forms. It's a little disheartening to see us go back to Boston to read essays again, because the primary literary genre of Transcendentalism is nonfiction, is the essay. And in particular, Emerson's style, Emerson being, of course, the chief American Transcendentalist author, is notoriously impenetrable. He is not writing to be understood, and he is not writing in a way that's linear, because one of the things that we're going to talk about is actually that Transcendentalism is a reaction to logical, rational, Enlightenment ways of thinking. And so as a result of that, you might imagine, Emerson's writing is not logical, rational, or enlightened by any stretch of the imagination. Now, some of the central presuppositions of Transcendentalism are shared with the Enlightenment, but in terms of style, I mean, nothing could be farther from sort of like the essays of someone like, for example, Thomas Paine in Common Sense, where even though obviously a lot of the flourish is rhetorical, he's sort of exaggerating things, it is very clear that Paine is trying to be logical, is trying to appeal to logos, appeal to logic, make rational arguments. He's writing linearly, it's very clear, it develops a clear argument from beginning to end. The way Emerson writes, the best way I've heard it described is it's kind of like a fractal. If you go in at a fractal at any point, it regenerates the entirety of the fractal. That's how you should read Emerson's essays. That's like the best tip I can give you, is that Emerson's essays, they're literally just quotes. It's like every sentence of an Emerson essay is a quote in and of itself. It's eminently quotable, it's interesting, but the quotes have no relation to each other. You could read an Emerson essay forwards, backwards, from the middle, randomly generated sentences, and it would basically say the same thing. It is very rare in the context of an Emerson essay that it's a clear argument from beginning to end. And so for that reason, Transcendentalism is difficult. It's a very difficult unit. And on top of that, we're dealing with very heady philosophical concepts that require a background that, again, for students could be very demanding. And so hopefully this note sheet will clarify some of these major concepts and make Emerson easy to read and intelligible, because what Emerson is saying is actually very intelligible and, quite frankly, very interesting and worthy of study, regardless of how you feel about Emerson. The question is whether or not you can understand it. And most people, the first time they read something like Self-Reliance, if it's not taught properly, they'll have no idea what's going on. They'll have no idea what's going on. Everybody reads Self-Reliance in high school. No one, including the people who teach it, actually know what it means. But I know what it means. I've spent a long time studying Transcendentalists. I've studied under people who know the Transcendentalists very, very well, and I do not know that as well as they do, but I know it pretty darn well. So one of the central ideas that's going to clarify Transcendentalist thought for us is from Emerson's journal, where he says, "In all of my lectures, I have taught one doctrine, namely the infinitude of the private man." Love that expression. The infinitude of the private man. And this relates to an idea that I think we need to get at right from the get-go, which is that Transcendentalism is American individualism taken to its logical extreme. There is no more extreme form of individualism than Emersonian individualism. Because what Emerson is really saying is that the individual is God. So it's like, imagine we start with the Puritans, where the individual is not of any particular value, we're all totally depraved. If you're chosen, it's not on the basis of your merits, it's on God electing you from before the beginning of time. Well, later we get the Enlightenment reaction to that, and when we looked at the autobiography of Ben Franklin, what do we see? Ben Franklin believes in this sort of Horatio Alger story, Horatio Alger avant la lettre, so to speak, where you work hard, You develop yourself, you acquire virtue, you move up in the world, you climb the social ladder, you make money, you make something of yourself. And you can sort of, in America, you can self-fashion. You can become anything you want. Well, Emerson is actually going to say the individual is God, and that you are capable of doing anything. So when we read nature, you will see quite literally at the end of nature, which is, by the way, is a brilliant structure for an essay, because nature, unlike Emerson's essays in the first and second series, it does have a logical structure, and the structure is mounting the spires of form. So it is successive levels of contemplation of nature. The lowest level for Emerson in the essay Nature is the economic contemplation of nature, which he calls commodity. It's like Minecraft uses of nature. You take a tree, you chop it down, you make a crafting table with it, right? You cook the pig meat and it becomes cooked pork, right? The economic uses of nature, you find oil, so on and so forth. Those are the lowest level uses of nature. We mount through successive spires of form to get to the highest level of nature, in which we realize we are actually God and that we are capable of doing anything that we want. That is literally what Emerson says at the end of Nature. Immediately prior, actually, in that penultimate section, I think this is almost a direct quote. He says, even in physics, the physical is degraded before the spiritual. Even in physics, the physical is degraded before the spiritual. Meaning, the spirit, the self, the soul, the I, has absolute sovereignty over matter, such that if you really wanted to, you could do anything. The private man is infinite, meaning you are infinite, meaning I am infinite, meaning Emerson is infinite. Well, how do we deal with the fact that we're all infinite? What if two infinities collide? These are the central questions of Transcendentalism, which we are going to start to answer in this particular lecture. But the short answer is Emerson's a solipsist, effectively. Emerson doesn't really believe that other people exist. And if you're interested in this, you can take a look at a wonderful book by an old professor of mine, Professor Michael Colicurcio, Emerson and Other Minds, which is 2-volume work, I think from Harvard University Press. Extraordinarily long, but a very detailed study of exactly this question. But the short answer, I would say, is that Emerson's a solipsist. Emerson fundamentally believes there is only one universal substance. And this gets to the next point. This universal substance is called the Oversoul, which is, in the sort of William James formulation, a new way of talking about an old thing. Emerson effectively is giving new vocabulary to some ideas that are very, very ancient, that go back to, I'm sure you're aware if you have some philosophical education, that go back to Vedanta in the Hindu world, that go back to Parmenides in the Greek, Latin West, that go back to Neoplatonists, that go back to all these different thinkers who are basically saying all things are just mind, all things are just soul. And this is, of course, a form of idealism. But what Emerson is effectively saying is we have this one universal substance called the Oversoul. And all things are the Oversoul. And if I perceive difference in objects, I see that over there as grass, that's a house, that's a jar, that's whatever. That's you, this is me. The perception of difference is only because I'm operating at a spiritually low level. Were I enlightened, were I to become the famous transparent eyeball, not, Mike, what's his name, from Monsters, Inc. But if you become the transparent eyeball, which we'll talk about when we get to nature, you will actually perceive at this highest level of reality that all things are actually just one thing, and that this is pantheism. All things are actually God, and you are God. There is no difference between God and you. You are truly infinite. So anything that could be predicated of God, omnipotence, omniscience, impassibility, like all these different things, those are true of you. And the fact that you don't perceive life that way is just because you're playing a game of hide and seek with yourself. You're playing this cosmic game of hide and seek in which you have put things under what Emerson actually won't use this terminology, but what has been called in the context of Hinduism and Buddhism, the veil of Maya, the veil of illusion. You have put this illusion upon yourself and you have forgotten that you are a god. And Emerson will say this over and over again in essays. So you get the famous Emerson quote, "Man is a god in ruins." Later he has another one. He's talking about dwarves. I can't remember the exact quote. But the man is a god in ruins is a very famous Emerson quote where essentially he's saying the same thing, is that we perceive ourselves as individual men and we don't perceive the whole totality, which is the Oversoul, which is pantheism, which is universal divine substance. Because why? Because we're playing this game of hide and seek with ourselves in which we hide from ourselves the way things actually are. Like, I'll read this quote for you here. We live in succession, in division, in parts and particles. Parts and particles. That's going to come up in a lot of different Emerson essays. So we see things as divided. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related. This is the doctrine of correspondence. Because all things are actually the same thing, because all things are part of this universal substance called the oversoul, everything is related to everything else, such that you cannot affect one part of the whole without affecting the entire thing. Now, of course, even the part itself is an illusion, but what Emerson means to say here, and this is very important for his philosophy of nature and the way that Emerson wants to recuperate nature, is by saying, like, look, if I look outside at the grass and I compare that grass to the structure of the valves in my heart, there is an analogy. If I want to, look at the way rabbits run in nature, I could learn a moral lesson from that. Why? Because morality, the interior morality of the human soul, and the motion of a rabbit, there's a correspondence between them because they're actually the same thing. So all things have a universal correspondence, and we can make analogies between them. And Emerson, very much like Nietzsche in this regard, is going to say that it's the job of the poet to create new analogies between things and thus open up new forms of knowledge and to spiritually awaken mankind. Now, Nietzsche will not use that vocabulary, but Nietzsche very clearly believes that the coming of the Overman, of the Übermensch, is going to be brought about linguistically and artistically by a revaluation or a transvaluation of all values that can only happen by using new names for things. And Nietzsche actually will call Emerson a brother soul, which, if you know anything about Nietzsche, is very high praise from Nietzsche. So there's a lot of similarities between Emerson and Nietzsche in this regard. In any case, meanwhile, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist, in whose beatitude is accessible to us, is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the particle, the subject and the object are one. There is fundamentally for Emerson no such thing as a subject-object distinction. We see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole of which these are the shining parts is the soul. So moving from that, what's the next piece of the puzzle in Emersonianism? Nature is positive, so very contra to the Puritan way of looking at nature. Nature itself is a positive thing. It is divine because it is God. So the tree is God, the horse manure is God, the field is God, the river is God, and it is didactic. You can learn from nature. This is the microcosm-macrocosm relationship. So Emerson sincerely believes that, like, nature is like a fractal. We're always looking at ourselves. So when you look out and you exteriorize, and you look out at a landscape, Emerson says you're not looking at a landscape of like mountains, a river, clouds, whatever. You're looking at yourself because you are God and all things are God. And so everything is you exteriorized. Therefore, when you look out at nature, you're actually understanding yourself. And it's like a fractal because it's infinite. The oversoul is infinite the way God is infinite. And so you can study a stream infinitely and come to infinite knowledge about all things that correspond to that stream, which, because the stream is everything, because the stream is the oversoul, you would come to learn about yourself. So nature can teach us didactic moral lessons, even beyond moral lessons, scientific lessons, just by observation of it. And this is something that's kind of just floating in the ethos of, 19th century romantic thought and even scientific thought. So as an example of this, like, you'll see Maury, the French scientist, French physicist. Maury makes the claims that the motion of blood within our circulatory system is actually a model for how hot and cold waters circulate in the oceans, which is a fascinating theory, that there's some sort of correspondence between the circulation of blood in the human body and the circulation of water in the oceans, that we can look at these two things and see a correspondence. And this is something that comes out in a lot of 19th century scientific thought. Now, it's later discredited. Is it discredited? Is it not? Not my place to say. But this is a very Emersonian idea, is that there's a relationship between all these different things. Meaning nature is an asset to humanity and not an interference to its well-being. And so we don't need to dominate nature either. We need to study nature because studying nature is the same thing as studying yourself. People can use nature to discover God's spirit, meaning you use it to discover the oversoul, which is yourself. And also the natural world serves as a doorway to the spiritual or ideal world, right? Because we only perceive nature as like, oh, there's a bunny, oh, there's a butterfly, oh, there's, whatever, because we're at this low level of spiritual awareness. Now, following this, and this is funny, Emerson has an essay in the first series. It's one of my favorite Emerson essays, though no one ever assigns it. It's called Prudence. And the thesis of Emerson's essay, Prudence, is that being prudent is a bad thing. You should be imprudent. You should act on impulse 100% of the time, because your impulses come from the self. They come from what is unique in you. Because Emerson, like the central question for an Emersonian, the same way you have the central question for the Puritan is, how do I know that I am saved? How do I know that I'm of the elect? Well, the central question for an Emersonian is, how do I lift up the veil of my eye? How do I come to see all things as being the one, the monad, the absolute, as being nothing more than universal manifestations of oversoul? And Emerson's solution to that, he talks about in Self-Reliance. And Self-Reliance is really a work of ethics. We read it as this stupid, banal series of platitudes about just be yourself. But Emerson is actually giving an ethical doctrine and also a metaphysical doctrine where he's basically saying the more that you are yourself, so the more you sort of narrow down your possibilities and become a unique individual, the more you will be able to lift up the veil of Maya and see that all things are actually just a reflection of the one, the absolute, the monad, the oversoul, which is you, which is yourself. So can individualism go any further? No. Ben Franklin's like, oh, you can become like a god. Emerson says, you are God, you just don't know it. You have absolute sovereignty over all things, you've just forgotten this fact. This is the Emersonian idea. And so, both in relation to the criticism of the Enlightenment, which Emerson is critical of for a number of reasons, but also in relation to this ethical doctrine, Emerson really thinks you should just operate on intuition and spontaneous feelings all of the time. You should do what you feel like. You should not try to rationally plan things out. You should act on spur of the moment impulses because they come from the higher self. And Emerson actually has a part of Self-Reliance, which of course we'll look at, where a Puritan says, well, how do you know you're not acting on demonic impulses? And Emerson basically says, one, if I have to act on demonic impulses, I'm going to do it. But two, Emerson makes an interesting claim that he says, this is actually a harder doctrine. Emerson says, I envy the people who follow traditional religious doctrines and have rules prescribed for them. Emerson says that would be easier to follow than having to follow my impulses all of the time. So he's saying it's not an excuse for hedonism. Emerson's saying actually being true to yourself, being authentic, operating from the deep, what do you want to call it? The deepest place of authenticity in the transcendentalist sense, being self-reliant is more difficult than following a prescribed system of rules. Whether that prescribed system of rules is Kantian, right, is sort of derived just from pure reason, or whether it's passed down as part of revelation. Emerson says, I envy the people who have that. And so as a result of that, as you can imagine, individualism must outweigh external authority, conformity, and societal rules. And Thoreau, of course, will develop this idea in Civil Disobedience, where Thoreau effectively says, if the laws of civil society conflict with my right to be a self-reliant individual, they conflict with my desire to be authentic, to be myself, so much the worse for civil society, I am going to disobey. Now, sources, reaction against New England Calvinism, that's a huge one, particularly because a lot of the Transcendentalists come from Unitarian families. Emerson comes from a Unitarian family. Early on, he's trained to be a teacher. He finds out, you can read the young journals. It's so sad. Your heart, you read like the first 2 volumes of Emerson's journals, your heart just breaks for the poor guy. It's like, even if you hate Emerson, like Emersonianism, Emerson the person is very sympathetic. He tries to be a teacher. It does not work out for him. He later decides, in a sort of climactic moment, he's going to go join the ministry. That ends up not working out as well. Surprise, surprise. But he decides he's going to become a Unitarian minister, and he studies under the Unitarian minister, William Ellery Channing, who, you can read William Ellery Channing. He's a quite eloquent writer. He has a famous essay where he says, if the God of Calvinism, meaning if the God of the Puritans were real, he would actually be Satan. No benevolent God would damn any portion of mankind in double predestination. That could not happen. And so William Ellery Channing, much more rational, optimistic, is going to say New England Calvinism is the devil, is from Satan. And so it's a total reaction against that. Emerson is steeped in this environment and really does believe this. And that sort of transcendental optimism is carried into transcendentalism. But you have to remember, transcendentalism is what comes after Emerson's Christian phase. Not that Unitarians are really Christians, right? They don't confess the Nicene Creed. but you at least have some residual aspects of Christianity there, like the miracles, the Gospels, Unitarians still believe in. There's a church service that at least in some vague way approximates the ancient Catholic rites. There's some Christianity left, but Emerson comes to a point where effectively he says, we still do this thing called the Lord's Supper, which of course is a sort of bastardized form of the Catholic Eucharist, the sacrament. We still do this thing called the Lord's Supper, but if Jesus is just a man, what is the reason why we do this? If Jesus was just a man, as the Unitarians believe, why do we continue to do this in memory of him? He was just a guy. And there's something inside of me that shines just as bright as it's shown in Jesus. And I'm going to follow that. So you might notice elements of Quakerism, the interior religion of the Holy Spirit, being moved by the Spirit, intuition, combined with Unitarianism, combined with just sort of general distancing from Christianity that's happening as a result of the aftermath of wars of religion, the sort of satanic pride of the American independence thing, the sort of Promethean nature of the American independence movement. All of these things kind of gel together at the perfect moment to say, no, we're going to leave Christianity behind and start a new spirituality. It's not really a religion, but a new spirituality, a new system of thought, a new way of thinking, which is all about the self, which is all about following the interior light of the self, in reaction also against Enlightenment rationalism, which they saw as going too far, in reaction against a deistic divine watchmaker who's too distant. Because think about it, Emerson actually places God at an uncomfortable, what do you want to say? At an uncomfortable closeness to human beings. Because instead of God in the, what do you want to call it, the deistic sense being super far off, unconcerned with human beings, he created the universe and basically left and abandoned us, Emerson's saying, no, every one of your thoughts is God. Go look outside, that's God. Go look at what's at your table right now, that's God. Go look at what your computer screen is showing you, that's God. God is everywhere. God is omnipresent in the pantheistic sense because all things are God. And the fact that you perceive difference is a sign that you are God and you have forgotten that you're God. So we get a sort of inversion in that sense from very, very far to uncomfortably close. Reaction against Lockean empiricism goes without saying. Emerging ideal of American democracy, again, especially in the context of individualism, you are important as an individual. You're not a cog in a machine. You're not part of a divine hierarchy of being. You're not, I'm happy I'm the drone bee, and I'm happy I'm the worker bee, and this, that, the other. You can become anything you want. You have the project of self-fashioning. You have the project of social mobility. And so this leads to a sort of, you could say, aggrandizement of the ego that culminates in Transcendentalism. German philosophy, even though Emerson himself never read Kant, was not super familiar with German philosophy was known secondhand by way of Coleridge, and particularly Coleridge, but also a little bit Wordsworth, both of whom were very popular in America. Also Thomas Carlyle, who's an idealist, was popular in America as well. And so German philosophy comes in secondhand that way. You also have a number of American ministers who go to study in Germany, which is the leading Protestant country of the period, and they soak up, They soak up a lot of the German philosophy and German, we want to call this like idealistic thought that way. Organicism, taken from Plato. So Emerson's going to say a lot of his ideas are just Neoplatonism. There is a little bit of a basis for that. There are some Neoplatonic bases for what Emerson is saying. Emerson very clearly had read Plato almost in its entirety, if not in its entirety. He thought very highly of Plato in his series of essays, really lectures, Representative Men. Plato is the representative of the philosopher. Emerson respected Plato, but he's going to go back to the Timaeus in the discussions of the creation of the world, the demiurge, and the sort of weird Platonic, like quasi, like proto-Gnostic doctrines, and say that there's something very similar to what Transcendentalism is saying there. And so Emerson's going to say the universe is alive and functions like an organism, much like what Plato says. Plato's justification for this is, why would God create a dead universe? If intellect is the highest good there is, there has to be a world spirit. The universe has to be alive the way a human being is alive. Emerson's going to say something similar, but just that the universe is God. The universe is God, and so the divine life force and vitality permeates the universe with infinite abundance because it is infinite abundance. It's just a disguise or a mask of this universal oversoul. Kant and the Neoplatonists, we don't need to get too much into that. If you are curious more about Kant, I talked a ton about Kant in the vocab lecture, which I think will be posted in the playlist after this on Transcendentalism. We go into Kant in a lot of detail, but I'm going to skip over that here. Romantic movement is another major influence on Transcendentalism. Again, the Romantics kind of filter out a little bit late to the American scene, but many American intellectuals at this point are familiar with Coleridge, Wordsworth, and the other English Romantics. Can't speak today. Unitarianism, yes. Eastern philosophy, another big one, with the expansion of the British Empire. Orientalism, translation of particularly the Hindu texts, and their sale in America. This is very important on Emerson. Emerson is actually going to make the claim that the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, the Upanishads, I think he says they're infinitely deeper than the Bible. And Thoreau was a big fan of the Bhagavad Gita as well. In fact, Thoreau, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, when he goes to Walden Pond to do his experiment at Walden Pond, he takes a flute with him in imitation of Krishna, which is quite funny. But the idea is we have all these Eastern texts, we're now exposed to new religious traditions. And this is a major, what do you want to say? A major source of scandal for Christians in the 19th century to go, oh my goodness, there are other religions. Most British subjects had some notion of Islam and Judaism, but they were kind of remote things. Like, oh, the Jews, they were just like the people who came before us, and then they rejected Christ, and they do some weird things, but they're kind of like us. And then Muslims were like pagans, but Muslims were understood as like, oh, they're way over there. I'm never going to see a Muslim. And they believe in all this weird stuff, and they can have multiple wives. And it was this weird sort of sensualist description of Islam. But like the actual existence of other religions and having to take that fact seriously is something quite new. And so encountering Hindus in particular, the translation of Chinese text, the translation of Japanese text, much later on, the translation of texts from Persia, these become major sources of scandal. And so Emerson reads the works of the British Orientalists who are translating texts out of Sanskrit, and he becomes fascinated in particular by the Vedas and says, no, the Vedas are deeper than Christianity. There's something here that Christianity is lacking, and becomes very influenced by that. Also, Emanuel Swedenborg, who I'm not going to get too much into because I talked about him in the vocab section as well, but he is a 18th century Swedish scientist, professor, I believe he's also a medical doctor, who all of a sudden has these weird visions of the other world. We're talking like traveled to the ninth gate, talked with dwarves and fairies, experienced heaven and hell, like really weird, detailed visions. And Swedenborg becomes immensely popular in America. You may know Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed actually travels across America spreading Swedenborgian doctrine. Swedenborg is very popular, and Emerson admires Swedenborg a lot because he sees Swedenborg as, in some ways, and I think he's correct in this, the logical conclusion of Protestantism, because it takes the doctrine of revelation, of pietism, and of, what do you want to say this? Freedom from tradition in the magisterium to its most logical conclusion, which is that this random scientist guy had all these personal revelations, and now we take them seriously and we take them as gospel. On top of that, it's tremendously freeing to see someone who was the standard subject of the Enlightenment, the rational, scientific thinker, have all these irrational experiences. That's something that's quite delightful for someone like Emerson. And so he admires Swedenborg a lot. And so you put all this stuff in a pot and you get Transcendentalism. Now, what are the ideals that Emerson is espousing for the Transcendentalist? Let's take a look here. According to Emerson, reason is the highest faculty of the soul. What we mean by the soul itself, it never reasons, never proves, it simply perceives. It is vision. This is actually a place where I would agree with Emerson. Plato says something very similar, in spite of what many would try to get you to think about Plato. But what Emerson is saying is, reason as we define it exists, but reason is different than rationality. Reason never reasons, never proves. So the soul does not need to reason or prove, it just intuits. It just is. It's just being. It's the floor of all things. And so this is why Emerson writes his essays the way he writes them. He's not trying to prove anything to you. He doesn't give a shit whether you understand what he's saying or not. He's not trying to prove it to you. He's not trying to convince you. Why would he try to convince you? You're just a universal mask of oversoul. He is just saying, this is the truth as I see it. Or better yet, this is the truth as I experience it. I experience this to be correct. And so I'm just going to say stuff. And Emerson's essays, it's him saying stuff. It's not him proving anything. It's not him making a logical argument. It's not a logical procedure between ideas. It's just him saying stuff. Because Emerson is effectively saying, I don't need to reason or prove. I just am. I'm acting from soul. I'm acting from universal identity. By contrast, it would be nice if I could speak today. By contrast, the understanding toils all the time, compares, contrives, adds, argues, nearsighted but strong-sighted, dwelling in the present, the expedient, the customary. Yeah, and so reason here, meaning intuition, functionally. It's like when Emerson defines prudent as being not prudent. Understanding beneath reason, and the understanding is a lower level faculty that operates rationally, but again, cannot do what the reason can do, because reason fundamentally pertains to the higher level of being, which is just existence. Now you have the relationship of the microcosm and the macrocosm, which we talked about. Each part of nature, part or particle, contains all within it. It's like a fractal. All things are the universal substance, oversoul, and so therefore we can look at anything and see everything else from it. Nature is a sea of forms, radically alike. Every particular in nature, a leaf, a drop, a crystal, a moment in time, is related to the whole and partakes of the perfection of the whole. Each particle is a microcosm and faithfully renders the likeness of the world. So there are analogy at all levels of creation. Emerson's famous quote here, man is an analogist and studies relations in all objects. And this is actually a revelation that Emerson has. He writes this down in his journal when he's in Europe. So he goes in Europe to do the grand tour after the death of his first wife. He's very distraught. He gets on the first ship going to Europe. It's going to Malta on Christmas Day. It's like the worst possible ship he could go on. But he does the tour, what do you want to say is, in opposite order or in reverse order. So he starts in Italy. He later ends up in England. But while he's in France, he goes to the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, which is effectively like a natural history museum. He observes all these different fossils and animals, and he goes, my goodness, man is an analogist. And he says, I say to myself continually, I shall become a naturalist. Because he keeps observing correspondences between things. He's saying, like, look, there's some sort of kinship between like a vegetable and a human being. There is some sort of kinship between a mineral and deep moral truths. And Emerson somehow has a spiritual experience in the Jardin des Plantes where he intuits this. And a later centerpiece of his philosophy is the idea of these analogical relationships between things. Every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact. Again, the oversoul, another good quote here, meanwhile within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related. And so we talked about organicism. The universe is a living being. Again, that's a microcosmic thing. We are living beings. We can see the whole universe as being a living being, or vice versa. Within a living being, we can see the entire universe. We also have the idea of a circle. Emerson's very fascinated by circles. He quotes from St. Augustine, who says, God is a circle whose circumference is everywhere and whose center is nowhere. And Emerson says this is sort of a central metaphor of life, is that as we lift up the veil of Maya and become more and more experienced, we expand our being out in progressively larger circles until eventually, in an ideal moment, we hit that sort of oceanic experience of enlightenment whereby we realize we are the circle whose circumference is everywhere and center is nowhere. We are the absolute, the monad, the one, the oversoul. But Emerson really believes this. Like, you have to, it's sort of an evolutionary perspective on philosophy, that you are like peeling back progressive layers of this onion. You are expanding out the circles of power by being self-reliant. The more self-reliant you are, the more you do what your intuition tells you to do and do not conform with what reality is asking you to do, the stronger and more powerful you will become as an individual. And as a result, you'll become more aware of the fact that you are God. I'll read this last note here. Transcendentalism, like other romantic movements, proposes that the essential nature of human beings is good, and that left in a state of nature, human beings would seek the good. So we believe in the innate goodness of human beings. Emerson is very clear on that. Society is to blame for the corruption that mankind endures. Now, as I mentioned, these note sheets are not mine. I will dispute this a little bit. When we talk about Hawthorne, you're going to see Hawthorne is a major critic of Emerson. Like, you cannot imagine a harsher critic of Emerson than Nathaniel Hawthorne. But we'll get into that when we get to Hawthorne and when we get to the Gothic. Hawthorne's juxtaposition of the red rose, the flower of nature, and the rusty blackened prison, the black flower of society, exemplifies this perspective. So the idea, this is from the Scarlet Letter, that you have the prison on the one hand, which is black, which is corrupted, which is indicative of societal level evil, but the rose, which in itself is pure and innocent. I would disagree with that reading of Hawthorne, but I suppose it's a very Emersonian reading of Hawthorne, which some people have. There are some scholars who say Hawthorne is more Emersonian than not. I would not be one of them. But in any case, this view opposes the neoclassical vision that society alone is responsible for keeping human beings from giving into their own brutish natures. Transcendentalism also takes the romantic view of man's steady degeneration from childhood to adulthood as he's corrupted by culture. A man is a god in ruins. Yeah, and so that quote doesn't actually show that, but Emerson is very clear in his valorization of childhood. Emerson believes that children have a certain primordial closeness to the divine state, which is something you see in a lot of like neo-spiritual movements. You see this in the hippies. You see this actually the hippies are a great example of this, because I think it's Timothy Leary who says at some point, or maybe it's Terence McKenna, one of the two like total stoner hippies, makes the claim that like children are basically stoned 24/7, that being a child is just like being on an acid trip, and that when you consume entheogens, when you consume drugs, you basically become like a child again and able to see the world in this way. And Emerson really does think something like that, is that part of our social conditioning causes us to forget the divine state of creativity and of godlikeness. And, not without a certain element of truth. I mean, it's often said, it's perhaps a cliche at this point, but that the highest level of neural connections you will ever have is at birth. And that from birth, you are basically going through a continuous process of neural pruning to remove connections and actually, as a result of that, perceive less of reality. This was Terence McKenna's big claim in his somewhat ridiculous but still quite interesting work, what is it called? The Food of the Gods, where he basically claims that people who consume psilocybin mushrooms, there have been studies that show that when there are two lines converging, they are able to predict with a higher level of accuracy when those lines converge. Now, I don't know the validity of the studies, but Terence McKenna basically says what that means is psilocybin mushrooms allow you to perceive a higher degree of reality. And that what happens is, as we get older, or in sobriety, we perceive less of reality. We perceive a smaller fraction of all that is, because it helps us deal with our day-to-day life, so on and so forth, but that through certain practices you can perceive more of it. I think Emerson would very much agree with that, not necessarily the druggy take on it, but the idea that children perceive more of reality than we do. And that we have, through this process of pruning, Emerson wouldn't have called it that, we progressively forget more and more of reality, forget things the way things actually are, and of course forget our natural godhood or God state. So this is a good overview of the Emersonian ideals and of Transcendentalism. This may have been a bit quick. I actually have a tutoring session I have to get to right after this, but it's been a while since I put up a video. I thought I would put up a video. Hopefully you found it helpful. If you have questions, because I understand Transcendentalism is not the easiest thing in the world to understand, please leave them down in the comments. I love receiving comments. I love asking questions, but I also love answering questions as well. Be happy to read those. And as always, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, I also have some good programs down in the description of this video, one of which is the College Degree Accelerator. If you know someone who is interested in trying to graduate college on an accelerated timeline, I'm not talking 4 years or 3 years, but you want to graduate in 2 years or less, just like I did. I graduated at 19, as some of you already know. I have a program that has an ebook, that has multiple courses, that has, video material, that has notes, so on and so forth, dedicated to helping people graduate from college early. It is a whole built-out program that has had a good amount of success. You can go take a look at that down in the description if you are interested. In any case, I am going to call it quits on going over the Transcendentalism note sheet. Take care. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all around. Take care.